So let me introduce you to your panel, who will come out and take their seats from my right round to my left. David Campbell Bannerman is a Conservative MEP and co-chair of Conservatives for Britain. He is backing Leave. John Mills is the director of Labour Leave. He is rather self-evidently backing Leave as well. And Peter Oborne, the writer for the Daily Mail, of course, and Peter asked me to just mention in passing a book about John Chilcot that is due.
The Chilcot report.
No, indeed.
10 days' time.
There you are. You see, I knew he'd do that. Catherine Stewart is here, who runs an agency which helps businesses operating within the EU. Andy Bagnall, the director of campaigns in the CBI, and Lucy Thomas, the deputy director of Britain Stronger in Europe. So we have Remain to my left and Leave to my right. So welcome them all, please. Are you all happy with microphones and refreshment and everything else that we need? Excellent. Okay, well, let's start with this minute from each member. I warned Peter I was going to pick him first. I also warned him I have a stopwatch on my clipboard. So what I'm going to ask of them here is just to literally put forward in front of you, we know that they're either Remain or Leave, but why do they feel the way they do? What's the strongest issue for them in arriving at the decision that they have? Peter Oborne, the floor is yours. My minute is about to start.
Thanks very much. For me, the biggest thing is democracy. I believe in parliamentary democracy, and the problem with the European Union is it isn't democratic. Decisions are made which don't really refer or which we can't affect here in Britain, or people in Greece or Germany or wherever they can't affect. In fact, in Europe, it's become really horrible because we've had a series of managed coups d'etats in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, where governments have been imposed by bankers and by the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the Commission against the will of the people. And that's really, I think it's terribly unhealthy to have a situation where the political entity, which is the European Union, is not the same as the voting entity, which is our nation states, Britain, France, and so forth. And that's very dangerous and actually can lead to all sorts of bad things.
55 seconds, Peter.
Oh, yeah, I do believe also, I do also believe that there is a relationship between freedom and economic vitality and strength.
Good.
And
that means you've gone over your minute, but thank you very much. Catherine Stewart.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I've spent the whole of my professional life trying to make EU legislation work better. I'm a lobbyist, and I've had clients in the business sector, charities, trade association, patients groups, etc. And I must say, well done, Bridget. I never thought you would be able to sell tickets to talk about the EU, let alone sell out tickets to talk about the EU. So this is really quite a breakthrough. I'm not going on to esoteric subjects like democracy and sovereignty. I really focus on two things. I'm an economist by education, so I know about assumptions. And I'm an entrepreneur. I've run my own business, so I know about taking risk. And I'm always up for taking a risk if there's a good opportunity. So I was very interested to see what the Brexit case was. And when the Brexit economists came out in April with their case, I read it with interest. But I found that their economic assumptions are very optimistic. They too admit that the risks are severe, that the exchange rate will drop.
Catherine, that's your minute near enough.
Okay, and I think that the rewards are very thin and unarticulated.
Thank you. We will develop that more, no doubt. John Mills, your minute.
Well, I don't think the EU's done nothing good over the years, but I do think we've never been in the EU on the right terms. And I think there are a number of really crucial issues where we have big problems. One is the cost of the EU, which is very high. It's about 12 billion pounds net, which is about a third of the total education budget we have in this country. I think we've got a big problem with border control and too much immigration and our population rising too fast. I think the EU itself has got problems with a very fragile economy, which hasn't grown since 2008, and migration problems, which we all know about. I think there's a big problem about democracy in the EU, difficult to control. Most people in this country don't feel that they can really influence what's going on there. But perhaps the biggest problem of all is the direction of travel overall in the EU, which is towards more and more centralisation, which they cannot avoid if they're going to stop the single currency, the Eurozone, falling apart. And I don't think that's where Britain wants to be.
John, that's your minute, but a brief final thought.
I don't think that's where Britain wants to be. I think we want to have loads of cooperation with other countries in Europe, but to be self-governing and with our Parliament controlling what goes on.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Let me go back to there. Andy Bagnall, your minute.
Thanks very much, Julian. At the CBI, we represent 190,000 businesses of all shapes and sizes across the country. And the majority of our members, and indeed a majority of businesses in every survey I've seen, support remaining in the European Union. And we think that's primarily because of the free trade area, the single market of 500 million people with one set of rules that allows businesses to buy and sell more easily than they would with different sets of regulations. The size of that single market also attracts investment into the UK as a gateway to that bigger market, and it also helps the EU negotiate on equal terms on trade deals in a world where there are countries the size of continents, you know, the United States, India, China, and so on. There's obviously some downsides. It's not perfect. There are costs for business, but overall, those costs and drawbacks are outweighed by the benefits that business receive, and the evidence suggests that the GDP boost outweighs the membership fee by perhaps as much as 10 to 1. There's pretty much an academic consensus that if the UK did vote to leave the EU, there'd be a shock to the economy. A number of studies have pointed that.
Andy, to the conclusion, if you would.
Every economic analysis points to job losses, lower growth, lower incomes for perhaps 15 years. And that's why the majority of businesses want to remain in.
OK, thank you. Two more to hear from. David Campbell Bannerman, put forward your minute. Yep, I think so. Give it.
It is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I actually have a place just up the road in Acton, so I'm quite local, really, as well as being east of England. The choice you have, ladies and gentlemen, on the 23rd of June, I believe, is between superstate or sovereignty. Either you want Britain to become a province like Quebec in Canada, and a kind of European version of Canada, or you want sovereignty to run our own country, as Peter's touched on, and be democratic again. That is, I'm a member of European Parliament. I see it close up. The EU has a flag, an anthem, a parliament, a civil service, embassies all around the world, and a currency that's destroyed a quarter of the Greek economy. The next stage is a social union, including paying for their pensions, an EU army, and that is a real proposal from President Juncker, and harmonised taxes. I don't want to go there. I don't want a superstate. The alternative is to get a great trade deal, like Canada is about to get, but be better than that, but run ourselves. And, what's wrong with running ourselves? Let's have confidence in ourselves. And I think that will bring back democratic control, economic control, and border control.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So one more to hear from. Lucy Thomas, your minute.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me. I too am a local Chiswick resident. I live just down the road. For me, I'm a passionate believer that we need to be in, but it's based on really pragmatic reasons, looking at whether we are stronger, whether we're safer, whether we're better off. All of these, I believe, are better if we remain in the EU, whether it's our economy, because, as Andy was saying, we're part of the largest free trade single market in the world, where almost half of our exports go. There's a market of 500 million consumers, and it's on our doorstep. Why would we walk away and risk all of that when there simply is no clear alternative? David talked about Canada as an option, but we don't know what kind of free trade deal we would get. And actually it's the remaining EU members who decide what deal we get. Britain gets locked out of the route. So on the basis of the certainty and the future of our economy, that is one reason. Whether it's about our security and whether our streets are safer. Currently, we benefit from Europol, from the European arrest warrant, from crucial counter-terrorism
Lucy, you're
data
nearly done.
sharing. So we're safer and more secure, and we're better off by being part of the EU. There is simply no alternative which gives us all of the benefits we currently get. Right.
Thank you all very much. I can put my phone away now. Let's open the debate up. The only slight issue I have in terms of seeing raised hands is that, as you will probably appreciate, while you're sitting there looking at us and we're all beautifully illuminated, you are a sort of general blur from where we're sitting because the lights are bright. So when it comes to moments of comment, I can see a hand, that's good. When it comes to moments, not yet. When it comes to moments of comment and questions, by all means gesticulate a little more wildly than you might otherwise expect to do, and that way you can catch my eye. But I'm going to move on to the issue of sovereignty first with those around the table. And at various points, some will clearly have strengths in the business field, in issues about security, policing, etc. Others more related to sovereignty, so everybody will have a fair crack. Lucy, let me start with you on sovereignty, because the point came out quite clearly from all the three gentlemen to my right about democracy and how far the UK still has an ability to make its own laws while a member of the European Union, and how much less it might be able to do that in the future if it stays. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think David's a shining example of the democracy in the EU. David was directly elected to the European Parliament, and so his constituents can decide to kick him out if they want. And David has a lot of influence over EU rules. If he says he doesn't, then I'm not sure why that is. But at a serious point, any EU rule that is decided goes to the Council of Ministers, which is the ministers from all EU countries, including ours, who are all democratically elected. So it is nonsense to say that the EU just sort of decides stuff and it gets handed down.
But those rules are proposed by the European Commission in the first place,
they are
aren't
proposed, but they are then amended and changed and never come into force until and unless they have gone through those government ministers and at times also amended by MEPs. But the wider point about sovereignty is this. It is about control. Do we control our destiny and what happens to us? And if you look at the current arrangements, we sit around the table, we decide those rules. If we leave the EU, depending on what deal we get, we still have to comply with many of those rules. For example, to export your car to the single market, it has to comply with those safety standards.
But the bottom,
and if you're not in the EU, you don't get to decide what they are.
But the bottom line,
far less control. It is far less sovereignty.
Right.
Because you are bound by rules which you have no say over.
But the bottom line I was getting at with you initially was that by being a member of the EU, we make far fewer of our laws at Westminster than we would do otherwise, and that is what worries people when they raise the issue of democracy and sovereignty.
No, but that's the point. So in order to continue to export, to continue all of the current trade benefits we get, we still have to comply with those EU rules.
Well,
So
that
it's
depends
not
on the
you
deal
just
that's done.
rip everything up. Whatever happens, you have to comply with the safety standards, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If you're like Norway or Switzerland and get access to the single market, Norway complies with 75% of EU rules. If you go for a Canada option, like David was talking about, you don't, for example, pay into the EU budget, but you still, in order to export still, almost half of our exports, they are bound by those rules. So you're... It's wrong to say that you just rip them up.
Okay. David Campbell Bannerman, come back on some of the points that Lucy's made, because she mentioned you and your powers within
Yes,
the European
lack of powers,
Parliament.
actually. Yes,
do you not feel you have any power in the European
Well,
Parliament?
I have, some powers, but I cannot initiate any new legislation, unlike an MP or a Lord. That comes from the Commission, as Lucy said, and it's them that propose legislation. Now, I can reform it to some extent, but we haven't won many votes because we're outvoted in the European Parliament. I would take issue. I mean, the reality is only 5% of our businesses trade with the EU at all. 95% don't. Only 10 to 12% of our economy is trade with the EU. I'm not saying it's unimportant because it is important, but the rest of the economy has to apply all those laws and regulations. And I think that is a huge saving. And I'm amazed, business organisations like the CBI are so in favour of all this red tape.
I don't suppose they are. Andy Bagnall.
No, we're certainly not in favour of red tape unnecessarily. I said in my opening lines that the EU is not perfect. You'll have often heard the CBI on behalf of its members railing against particular pieces of regulation. But we shouldn't forget the point that overall, regulation creates a single market. You do need a common set of rules in order to trade freely without those extra administrative costs within a common market. Could I just pick up the sovereignty
Yes,
point
I'd like you to
quickly?
stick with that for the time being, yeah.
Lucy has touched on this already. I think it's important to be really upfront about this. Certainly in some areas, the European Union is an exercise in pooling sovereignty. If you interpret sovereignty as just a very narrow way of ability to make a decision, absolutely we're giving something up. If, on the other hand, you interpret sovereignty as the ability to get an outcome in the national interest, actually we're gaining something. We're magnifying our ability to influence outcomes that certainly affect British business for the better. We've been talking about those rules. Having a common set of rules that we influence in our largest trading partners is actually good for us. And yes, of course, in a club of 28, you don't always get your way, but nevertheless, your ability to get your way a lot of the time is enhanced by being part of the forum, by having a seat at the table. It's also important to recognise that in lots of key areas that people would think of in sovereignty, the health service, the education system, tax system, national defence, we remain sovereign. The Westminster Parliament decides on those issues. It's actually mostly in my member sphere, the economic sphere, that we get together and decide those rules and regulations. And that's what most of the regulations that come from Brussels, which we help shape, most of them are about doing business.
But you talk about a seat at the table. Here we have somebody who has a seat at the table and he doesn't think it's worth sitting at.
I mean, if I just got, I mean, the point is we have given up our seat in the World Trade Organization and therefore we do not do our own trade deals around the world. I'm on the Trade Committee. TTIP is failing, India's failing. After 9 years of negotiations, EU hasn't even started on China. We could take back our seat in the World Trade Organization and do our own trade deals.
OK, I want to come back to trade deals in a moment, but let me bring John Mills on what we've heard so far.
Well, I think one of the things to remember is that the EU was always set up in the first place not to be very democratic. It was set up to be run by technocrats, and that's exactly what it is. It's the Commission that decides what legislation is going to be considered, and the Commission inevitably, because it's a self-perpetuating bureaucracy, is very self-serving. And if you look at the decisions that are taken on things like the single market, we've been outvoted, I think, 70 times altogether. And it's hardly surprising because we've only got 8% of the votes in some deliberations and 12% in others. So we're actually in a very small minority. The one thing I would say to you is that if you vote to stay in on the 23rd of June, you can kiss goodbye to Britain's influence in the EU for change becoming really effective at all.
Why?
Well, because I think if we vote to leave, vote to remain, what all the bureaucrats and the political class in Brussels will say is you've had your chance, you knew exactly what you were letting yourself in for, you voted to stay in, now you can just put up with everything else we want to do as we move towards having a federal Europe. That's what's going to happen.
But we have a prime ministerial deal done which allows national parliaments to block legislation in a way that they haven't before, and that is in place if we vote Remain.
It's never going to happen. The deal, the red card deal involves an enormous amount of coordination. I think it's 15 or something legislators. It's never going to happen in a million years. It's nothing more than a fig leaf.
55% objections on grounds of subsidiarity, 55% of national parliaments, that red card comes into play. Mr. Cameron thinks it's a good deal in a few weeks.
Well, I must say, I think he's really deluding himself if he thinks that deal is going to be worth the paper it's written on.
Let me bring Catherine in on the issues we've talked about so far.
Sovereignty. I quite like the communist analogy of, if you want to be sovereign, you need to be North Korea. How sovereign? We are actually quite sovereign because we're having this referendum. We can choose to leave, which is an exercise of sovereignty. If you look at the other international organisations which we belong to, the WTO, NATO, the UN, we pool our sovereignty there, and decisions are made there which are imposed upon us. But actually, they're all much less, they have many fewer democratic mechanisms than the EU. I don't need to go into the whole issue, but in terms of national parliaments scrutinising legislation, a directly elected parliament, national ministers meeting in public to debate their decisions. Of all the international organisations, the EU is the most democratic. And hey, we're in an interconnected world. We can't control everything. I don't control everything in my household, so I can't believe we can control everything in our country.
But that's accepting second best, isn't it, to a degree?
No, I don't think so at all, because I don't think we have a monopoly on wisdom either. I think there's a lot of things we can learn from other countries, and I think there's a lot of things that you can do together. You have much greater a greater influence together. And in fact, if as I have done, you've watched the development of the EU over the last 30 years, it's moved to a much more liberal, open, market-based organisation. And that's because, you know, we have the Finns, the Swedes, the Dutch, the Brits, the Irish, all pulling in the same direction. If you look at the most senior posts in the European Commission now, they are all held by very often former prime ministers, if not cabinet ministers, of those northern liberal economic countries. So I think a lot of the things we're hearing about were absolutely true 15, 20 years ago, but the EU is changing quite significantly. And in terms of the challenges we have both economically and politically, which we'll doubtless come on to, we're much better placed to be in it than out of it.
Okay, I'll bring Peter in with his thoughts, particularly on sovereignty, because you mentioned democracy as part of your opening minute, and then I'll open up some thoughts specifically on sovereignty if we can at this point. Peter.
I wonder how many of us in the audience could name the Speaker of the European Parliament.
There isn't one.
Exactly, but I was exactly, and there is somebody who does. But thank you for answering for the audience.
But how many could name the Speaker of the House of Commons?
The man who does the job of Speaker is Martin Schulz, who's the President, one of these numerous presidents. Let's have another try. TTIP was mentioned. Who can say what TTIP stands for?
Transatlantic.
Who will tell us how many times has TTIP been debated in the British Parliament? The answer is none. And not at all. Now, TTIP is a very... TTIP has not been... Yeah, it doesn't show it hasn't been debated in the English Parliament, British Parliament at all. Now, TTIP is a very... A lot of people say of TTIP, this is a very, very dangerous deal. It's a deal which a lot of people who know what they're talking about say will wipe out our minimum wage. It'll get rid of our health and safety arrangements. Why is it? Sorry. Why is it that it hasn't been discussed in the British Parliament? It's deemed a European matter. Now, MEPs are allowed to see it, but only in secret. They're only in locked up. No, it hasn't been discussed. Only in locked up rooms. They're not allowed to see it publicly. They're not allowed to discuss it because it's secret. Now that is Now, do you really want the problem with Europe? Really is simply this. All of us would love to have a single market, a free trade area. But what Europe has done is taken away democracy from the member states. And it has this objective to be a union. It's setting about on it very fast. It's taken away our ability to shape our destinies. And it's just, again, as I say, very, very dangerous. Look at Greece.
But you heard Lucy's argument. You heard how she portrayed the democratic elements of how things work, how the national parliaments will have a say, how the European Parliament, admittedly not to the liking of David Campbell Bannerman, would have a say. In other words, there are democratic mechanisms within what we currently have.
That's dreamland. I don't think that... The problem is that voters in Britain, but also across the rest of Europe, they respond, they see national parliaments. Very few, with great respect to Mr. Campbell Bannerman, who comes the heir of a very respectable family of British prime ministers. Nobody knows very few of the people who could name him who actually voted, who are in his so-called constituency. We do know and can hold to account our own MPs. What happened? Brussels, you're a lobbyist. All legislation comes from the Commission. It's produced by these lobbyists acting for large international corporations who produce the laws.
Hold on a second,
to do.
Peter. I want to bring the real audience in. I saw some hands. I saw some comments. Some thoughts, particularly on sovereignty at this stage. Then I'll re-bring. I can see a hand to my left here. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. I just want to ask the different groups, and particularly Mr. Oborne, what does he think is the, or do they think is the outcome of multiple sovereign states acting only in their own interest?
Peter Oborne, do you want to deal with that?
Yeah, it's called democracy. It's worked very well in the Western world for the last 50 years. And if you try and have a single state, which is presumably what the alternative you're suggesting is, controlling numerous different nations, different communities, is a recipe for calamity.
David Campbell Bannerman, you wanted to come in on that, and then I'll come back to you if I may.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. the difference between the EU and other bodies like NATO, the UN, WTO, is the EU is supranational. It's able to override national sovereignty, whereas all those other bodies are intergovernmental. This is absolutely where the EU architecture is wrong. I mean, you've got Hungary challenging its migrant target given to it by an unelected commissioner. You have President Juncker just this last week berating prime ministers for listening to their voters. I mean, that was actually a story this week. That is the problem. It's supranational, intergovernmental. Intergovernmental, we don't have a problem. We don't have debates like this on the UN or the WTO.
Can I ask you why that issue was in your mind?
The reason it was in my mind was because my sense was that the EU was developed to try and make sure that we didn't have another world war, which seems to have just been lost in so much of this. And if everyone is just battling and fighting for their own borders, interests, I think it leads to sort of some of the things that have been talked about in the news, which are really negative.
When David Cameron, for example, raised the fact, as he said, that he felt that war was more likely if Britain leaves the EU, were you with him
I agree, yeah.
on that?
I agree.
Andy Bagnall, you caught my eye.
She asked my question. She asked me the question. I mean, the NATO is the reason we haven't had a war for the last since 1945 in Europe. It's nothing to do with Europe, but by the systematic degradation of nation states, the destruction of Greece, the destruction of Portugal, the near destruction of Italy, the emerging destruction of France. This is incredibly unstable. This is going to create wars because you have one unelected nation centre telling people in the outlying parts that they can go and get lost and that they have got to run economies which don't work, wiping out entire national industries. That is a recipe for war.
Andy Bagnall, you wanted to come in.
I don't think one should underplay the role of the European Union in keeping the peace. It isn't NATO, incidentally, as was said earlier, another supranational organisation which we're a member of, where we pool sovereignty intergovernmental,
yes.
But the point is, the European Union had a role in keeping the peace. Look at the role of the EU in the transition from totalitarian regimes to, broadly speaking, Western liberal democracies of Eastern Europe, and that, incidentally, was something driven by British foreign policy, an example where we have influence in the European Union. And it's those kind of challenges where actually either intergovernmental or indeed supranational organisations come into play. Look at some of the challenges facing Europe today, whether it's climate change, whether it's a refugee crisis driven by events in the Middle East, whether it's the activities of President Putin in Ukraine on our eastern borders. None of those problems are going to be solved by individual action by the nation states of Western Europe or indeed Eastern Europe. We need collective action, whether we're part of the European Union or not. And the European Union does provide a structure within which to take collective action.
So the fact that the EU now has a far bigger foreign policy arm than it once did, you're comfortable with that, are you?
Well, look, I'm speaking personally here rather than the CBI.
Yeah.
We don't have as much.
No, I accept that.
But certainly, foreign policy, defence of the realm are areas where nation states retain sovereignty.
David Campbell Bannerman, a brief word on that. Then I'll bring Lucy, and then I'll go back to the audience.
Sorry, I really object to the fact that thanks to the Lisbon Treaty, we now have the External Action Service of the EU with all these diplomats, 300 of whom are paid more than our Prime Minister, for example. And they go around the world selling the benefits of the EU, not of Britain or the nation states. It's the benefits of CAP or the benefits of the euro, how wonderful it all is. You say it's very important for Ukraine or Iraq, but there have been disasters. The association agreement, the trade agreement, and political agreement the EU pushed on Ukraine led to losing Crimea. And I'm not saying Putin is bad, but the point is, because Putin is bad, you have to handle it better. And they handle it disastrously. And then now, $100 billion, thanks to the Iran deal, has been freed up. So Salman Rushdie has now got a fatwa on him for $600,000 as part of it.
Let me bring Lucy in briefly, and then I'll come back to the audience for a few more thoughts on sovereignty before we move on. Lucy.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I just wondered, does David think that we would have managed to leverage sanctions against Russia? Do you think we would have got such a good sort of nuclear deal by acting unilaterally? Because this is the point. you are part of something bigger in the EU. You are negotiating, whether it's a trade deal, whether it's any kind of global issue like Russia or Iran, and working together with the clout of those 500 million people, whether on sanctions or something else. You achieve so much more. We have a bigger voice on the world stage. And I simply don't think it is British to turn our backs on that, to walk away from playing our full role and working with our neighbours and allies on these huge global issues.
And that was a point made by President Obama, was it not, David Campbell
Well, he
Bannerman?
made many points, that, most of which were
Well,
wrong.
he also said, when push comes to shove, if he had to do a deal with the EU or just the UK, he'd go to the EU first.
Well, can I just say, I'm on the Trade Committee. What Lucy said earlier is wrong. The World Trade Organization has a set of rules. We are members of the World Trade Organization. We get exactly the same deal pre-TTIP now with the United States of America as the EU has now, and the same with Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, India, etc., etc. So we have these WTO rules. We'll get an automatic deal, and that's Obama's misleading on
Right, I'll come back to that. Can I just go back to the audience briefly, if I may, because I want to make sure we get some sovereignty points in. Yes, sir, I can see your hand. What would you like to say?
Yeah, thanks. Just to the Leave side. Well, firstly, thanks to my smartphone, I'm actually reading a Hansard debate about TTIP now, and there's many more of them, so you should check that out. But one of the main points of your side is that we would be free to strike all these trade deals, when through TTIP, the EU is striking a trade deal with the biggest economy that the world has ever seen. I don't see how that adds up, especially given that we would probably not be able to leverage anything as near as good if we were an independent state.
Okay, John Mills, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think that's not at all clear that that's the case. If you look at the history of the EU in striking trade deals, it has got quite a lot in place, but most of them are with very small countries. What they haven't done is to get a trade deal in place with Japan. They haven't got one with China, they haven't got one with India, they haven't got one with Australia, and they haven't got one with the United States. And the main reason for this is that if you have 28 countries, all of who've got some sort of axe to grind, it's very difficult to get agreement across the piece. And I think TTIP's got all sorts of problems with it. But I mean, the very fact is that negotiation has been going on for years and years and years, and has got stuck because the French won't agree to have films included, and the British are worried about the National Health Service, and there's just too much diversity.
Okay, I want to go back one more hand behind the gentleman who just spoke. Yeah.
A question about the TTIP. Don't you think that if we're negotiating with America and we are worried about the impact of American corporations like Google and Facebook and their behaviour in Europe, to do that as part of a 27-nation united bloc, negotiating a position where we can actually regulate their behaviour, we're in a much stronger position than we are if we allow American corporations to pick us off individually, country by country?
Right, Andy Bagnall, quick point on that, then I'll come to this side, then I'll move on to trade and business, because we're kind of going there anyway. Andy,
Well,
quick
absolutely,
word.
I was just going to pick up that point. Look, size does matter in trade deals, exactly as the questioner said. If you look at the Switzerland-China trade deal, China has 15 years to abolish 85% of its tariffs on Swiss goods coming into China. Switzerland abolishes 99% of its tariffs immediately on Chinese goods coming into Switzerland. So size does matter in terms of the deal you can get. Being a bigger bloc does help in terms of negotiation.
David Campbell Bannerman, quick point on that, then I'll move on to...
Yes, can I say the latest on TTIP, they've had 13 negotiating rounds, and there's the due the 14th in June, but it is in serious danger of collapse. Both Austrian presidential candidates have pledged to veto it. Hollande of France has pledged to veto it. It's running into heavy water because the EU is trying to force standards on the US, or that's the way they see it, and that would drive up their costs. So don't assume these things are going to go through. And just on that note, Iceland, population 300,000, has a trade deal with China. And I asked the question in the Trade Committee, why hasn't the EU even started a trade deal with China? It hasn't even started, and it's not going to start for years.
Okay, I'm going to move on to sort of trade and business matters, economics as well, because we've kind of naturally headed in that direction. John Mills, you spoke a moment ago about the lack of speed and alacrity of the European Union in terms of doing deals with a variety of different countries. Yet my understanding of the position on this side of the room is that when Britain leaves the EU, there will be quite a swift deal done to arrive at some sort of trade arrangement. How can a body that is so slow-moving and lacking in agility suddenly produce this fleet-of-foot approach to negotiations when the UK are involved?
Well, if you're talking about what's going to happen between Britain or the UK and the European Union post-Brexit, I think it's extremely unlikely that we will not finish up with the same free trade area that we've got right across Europe at the moment. There is free trade in industrial goods from Iceland to Turkey, from Latvia to Portugal. The idea that we're going to finish up with Britain as a little island in the middle with no free trade, but everybody else has it, is honestly totally unrealistic.
But to be clear, you don't want to be in the single market, no?
Well, you don't have to be in the single market.
No, I accept that. I just wondered where you stand on it.
I think the best solution is to be in EFTA, not the EEA,
right?
Because otherwise you're not going to have any border control.
And the reason you don't want to be in the single market is why, specifically?
Well, you don't need to be in the single market. China isn't in the single market. Canada isn't in the single market. It doesn't stop you selling there to the single market. Actually, I think it's very likely we'd have free trade with Europe for all the reasons I've just given you, in which case you get all the benefits and none of the costs, and that seems to me to be exactly where we ought to be.
Catherine, come in on this issue specifically in terms of the deal that we might end up having to do if we left.
I'd like to take up the point about the single market, because the whole point of the single market is that we can trust what we buy in our shops. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember when you travelled to France and it was eau non potable, because their drinking water was legislation was such you couldn't drink the water out of the tap. Now, thanks principally to a British Labour MEP, we have a drinking water directive, which means that throughout the 28 member states, the drinking water that comes out of the tap is drinkable, and we can all know that that's happened. And the same is true of the washing machines we buy, of the cars we buy. This is what this bureaucratic red tape is all about. It's actually getting rid of 28 sets of standards and rules, so we have one. And so, yes, China and the US sell their goods into the EU, but they sell their goods according to EU standards. So they have to have a separate production line to make washing machines that comply with EU standards. If you've ever done your washing in the US, you'll know their washing machines are extremely different from the washing machines here. So we will absolutely be able to sell into the EU, but James Dyson will need to make his hoovers in accordance with EU regulations, as well as whatever regulations we then have in the UK. So actually it's not really very cost efficient.
But there is a admittedly slightly cynical argument to that, though, is there not, that says, fine, we've got to a point where the drinking water is as it is and where the washing machines are as they are, and that's not going to change. If we leave, we might, these people would argue, gain in other ways and still benefit from that.
Let's look forward. I mean, the future business is technology, and it's virtual goods. It is the digital single market. At the moment, you can't actually buy from Amazon across a border. I have to go to Amazon FR. I can't go to amazon.co.uk in Brussels to buy my books. And that is all to do with national regulations. So it's exactly like we were 20 or 30 years ago in terms of goods. So we need to get a whole new raft of EU standards on things like copyright. The copyright legislation is way out of date for what we all want to do with our Netflix and our Spotifys, etc., etc. We can't do that on our own, and we're the ones who want to be we, the UK, are way ahead. We have Silicon Roundabout in the East End. You have Tech UK saying it is really important for us to stay in the EU because we need to break down those technological national barriers.
Some thoughts from the audience on what we've said so far via John and Catherine, if you have any. Otherwise, I'll bring in some more panel comments. Specifically on this issue now of trade. Yes, sir.
I think there are undoubted benefits for being part of a free trade area, for being part of the European free trade area at the moment. I'm less convinced that the regulation the European Union puts in place actually offers anything to business with due regard. What I really find curious is that we're talking about 2016 now, but I want to think about 10 or 15 years ahead, because all that we hear about at the moment from the Remain camp is scaremongering about, if we leave, the world will end. We don't hear anything about what the risks involved if we remain, and there are risks for businesses if we remain. To give you one example, in my own area of expertise, There's a European Accessibility Act coming through that will come into effect in 2026. Totally unnecessary at a trans-European level. It will impose additional costs on business, and you will be expected to meet those costs. If we stay in the European Union, the problem I have is that the Commission is continuing to act in a way whereby it stops taking due regard of its competencies and instead takes account of its intention to become a super state. And in that respect, it doesn't look after business, it looks after political interest.
Okay. Catherine, a very brief response to that, then I'll bring in Peter Oborne.
Actually, very interesting. This Commission has cut about 80% of the proposed legislation that was which was on the table. And David and I were laughing before. Actually, there's not enough for the European Parliament to do now. There is so little new legislation coming through the system. And what they're now looking at is that existing legislation. It needs to be better, and the regulation needs to be better. So a lot of stuff is coming off the table. So I agree with you. There is a lot of stuff out there, and I spent my life trying to make this legislation better for business. But there is, we're really talking in the past, and I absolutely agree, we need to look in the future, and what are the challenges in the future, and are we better for our economic and our social challenges if we stay in?
Peter Oborne, deal with the arguments we've heard so far from the Remain side on this specific issue of trade, the Single European Act, single currency, you know what I mean, market, thank you, and other elements that you've heard so far.
By the way, I apologise about TTIP. I was misinformed, obviously.
You've had an apology.
Thank you very much for putting me right. I think I'm not an expert on economics, but it is clearly the case that the trade deficit which we have with Europe means that they are not going to try and exclude us. They need our market at least as much as we need Europe. And so I don't, and also we can control our destiny outside. I think there is to return to the democratic point, there is a deep relationship between democracy, freedom, and prosperity. That's what history teaches us. And a top-heavy bureaucratic organisation which is hostile to wealth, which is systematically destroying the economics of so many of its own countries, I find it very, very hard to understand how anybody can support a European Union which has destroyed Greece. Try going to Greece. Try going to Seville. Lionel Barber, the editor of the FT, was in Seville. He tweeted out a picture. He said, "What a lovely city." I looked at the FT. I tweeted him back, Lionel, his latest story about 55% youth unemployment. That is disgusting. And there's nothing that Spain, there's nothing that Greece, there's nothing that these countries can do about the systematic degradation, the loss of entire generations, the wiping out of industries, because they have their economics set for them by the European Union.
Because they're in the euro and we're not.
Yeah, sure, but they don't. This is the next thing. Well, actually, this leads us on to a very, very exactly.
But that's an important point, though.
It's a very important point. But I do think this is something which we need to resolve.
Right.
Because I don't believe. Are we going to have? Because I don't believe it, and I do think it goes to the heart of it.
Yeah, no.
We have Europe is economically on a massive downward trend. It was going to stay on that downward trend until the euro collapses. At that point, parts of the European Union will start to revive, and the sooner the better. I don't think we can stay in that Europe. That sort of walking catastrophe, which is what Europe is economically at the moment.
Okay, Lucy Thomas, a response to that.
Well, gosh, where do I start? This is not a referendum on all these other countries, which democratically themselves decided to join the euro. We are not part of the euro.
By the way, you wanted to join the euro.
Did I?
Yes, you
really?
did. The CBI did. It was.
I know that's Andy Bagnall having a go at. Yes. Don't aim it at the wrong person.
That's news. That's absolutely news.
It's staying silent on that point.
Okay,
Lucy.
It's absolutely news to me. I was actually a university student who hadn't at all made up my mind on any of this stuff. So I think, thanks. I'll speak for myself on that one.
She hadn't read your column at that point.
It's a hugely important point, this is about the future of Britain and whether we are stronger and safer and all those things, in or out. And people like Peter try and tar everybody on my side of the argument with, you said that about the euro, you wanted to join the euro. Actually, so many of the people on our side, today Ed Balls was out with George Osborne and others, all of whom didn't want to join the euro. So I think let's be clear and let's not sort of smear people. That would be good. But just going back to these trade points, which I think are hugely important, David said if we fall back on WTO rules, it'll all be fine. Let's just be clear what they are. That means tariffs and other barriers. So cars, for example, would face tariffs of 10%, commercial vehicles 22%. That would make our exports so uncompetitive. We export 50% of the cars we make here to the rest of the EU. So suddenly they are 10% more expensive. So let's be clear. The former head of the WTO, Pascal Lamy, who ran the WTO for 8 years, said it would be crazy for the UK to follow the WTO model. So I'm not sure why we would want to do that. And lastly, all of the EU free trade deals that all of you talk about, whether it's being like Canada or even Switzerland to have some sort of access to the single market, they do not have access in services. Britain's economy is almost 80% services. We are a net exporter in services to the EU, and I simply do not want our services sector to not have free access to the single market. And crucially, the City of London, which is totally reliant on exporting to the single market using the single financial passport, it's a horrible technical term, but no country outside of the EU has access to that single financial passport.
Okay.
And France and Germany would be lapping up all of the banks, which would leave London pretty damn quick.
David Campbell Bannerman, there's a future that I don't suppose you're relishing.
Can I just say, let's be clear on this, WTO rules are guaranteed, right? So you will get a WTO deal, whatever happens, worst case scenario. We will do a trade deal on top of that, which I call WTO Plus, which is what the Canadian trade deal is and what TTIP is. It's better than WTO rules.
But those have taken a long time, is the point I was putting.
Yes, but guess what?
Why would this one suddenly be so speedy?
Well, because we are a EU member and they are not. We are already compliant. We don't have any tariffs or quotas or restrictions at the moment because we're in the EU. So we just replicate that with a free trade agreement.
But we're walking away from an organisation and might be upsetting them in the process. So why is it in their interest to be so compliant?
Well, because we're the largest single customer. I mean, you rightly say about tariffs on the WTO. How long do you think it will take for BMW to call Merkel if BMW is facing 10% tariffs? It won't take very long. They sell a huge amount to this country. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. Look, I've done a trade paper on this. We are guaranteed a trade deal. If you ask my colleagues, German MEPs, they will tell you a trade deal is guaranteed.
A trade deal, okay.
Yes.
Andy Bagnall,
you want my paper, New Direction, if you want to read it.
Okay, fair enough. Andy Bagnall.
Could I just pick up this point?
Yeah.
You hear this a lot in the debate around sort of they need us more than we need them.
Yeah.
And it just fundamentally isn't right. I mean, I wish I could share David's optimism, but trade deals are enormously difficult to negotiate, and there's no guarantee whatsoever that we could get one in the 2-year time frame that's set out.
But just to be clear, about half of the UK trade is conducted with the EU at the moment, is it not?
Very much. And now, but this is the point. It is absolutely true that in goods, at least, they sell more, and indeed overall, they sell more to us than we do to them. Right. We have a trade deficit. So you might think, well, they will therefore need us more. But look at what's actually at stake in the negotiation. Exactly as you say, Julian, half of our trade, representing about 15% of our gross domestic product, is on the table. It's at stake if we can't get a deal. The corresponding figures for the other 27 member states are less than 10% of their total trade, and about 2% of their GDP is on the table. We need a deal much more. Half of our trade is at stake. Less than 10% of their trade is at stake. So the idea that we would have the whip hand in those negotiations is false. And as Julian has said, in terms of time, there's a 2-year ticking clock. So we needing a deal more. If we don't get a deal in those 2 years, we do drop out into WTO. Now, on this point, David's absolutely right. That's guaranteed. But Lucy's already said it. That's deeply unattractive for CBI members. 10% tariffs on cars, 20% on alcohol, 5% on chemicals. And those are the rules of the WTO, that they have to apply those tariffs if we haven't got a free trade agreement in that very short window.
Just for the record, did you want to join the euro?
So the CBI gave cautious support, as the government did at the moment, qualified support. It said if the conditions were right, we should join. We saw some benefits.
We were in Gordon Brown's 5 points territory.
But let me just say one point on the euro. Yeah. The point is with the euro, we were all predicting or looking at hypothetical benefits or disbenefits into the future. That is fundamentally different from the debate now, which is about tangible benefits that CBI members tell us they experience every day from having that access to a market.
I saw a hand. A gentleman in the white shirt. You've got the microphone. Excellent.
So as we're talking about the trade deals and the post-Brexit negotiations potentially, I thought about what are the mechanics and the constitutional implications of Brexit, because even if you vote to leave, there's no legal obligation for Parliament to actually enact that in legislation. Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty would oblige us to be out the door, like outside of negotiations taking part. So therefore, how are we going to get a good deal when we're not there for the actual negotiations, when there's no constitutional obligation for David Cameron or whoever, Boris Johnson, to actually make these happen? How is that going to be conducive to a good trade agreement with the EU or with other countries?
David, I think you're keen to answer that.
Yes, thank you. I mean, yeah, Article 50, as you mentioned, of the Lisbon Treaty, you're right, it requires EU to negotiate a withdrawal agreement, as they call it, trade and political, with a departing member. I mean, you get about up to 2 years to negotiate, and you can extend it. That is true. That's all part of it. But the point is, I as an MEP, a British MEP, is likely to vote on that free trade agreement because it's only the Council that the UK is excluded from only for discussion of a UK-EU free trade agreement. Everything else carries on June the 24th. We're not leaving on June the 24th, by the way.
No.
Everything carries on. It's the start of a process. But, you know, TTIP doesn't have a constitutional imperative from the EU to negotiate it, nor does Canada. No other country will have a constitutional imperative. The Commission will make it a priority to negotiate a deal with us.
OK, Catherine, you wanted a word. I know Lucy did too. Catherine, briefly, and then I'll come back to some more comments.
Yeah, no, I'm quite interested because, as we all know, the UK is the 5th largest economy in the world, and that's while we've been in the EU. So, I mean, what are we aspiring to be the 3rd largest or the 2nd largest? I mean, it can't have been all bad.
Fifth. No, it's fifth.
Yes, we're 5th now.
We're 5th
yes,
now.
absolutely.
We're 5th now.
Fourth now will be 5th if Sterling drops another 5%. France will overtake.
Go on, sorry, Catherine, I interrupted.
But one of your colleagues, Daniel Hannan, who's an MEP, is very strong on the Anglosphere. So once we've left the EU, we're going to have this wonderful new golden age where we trade with the Anglosphere, which is basically former Commonwealth countries and the US. And yet I haven't heard a single one of those countries basically saying, yeah, come out, because we're really keen to do a deal with you. On the contrary, New Zealand have said, you're crazy.
Well, they wouldn't say it yet, would they, surely?
Well,
they'd surely wait.
Yeah, I mean, surely if they really wanted to do a deal with us, they'd be encouraging us to come out, just as others encouraging to stay in. You know, I have a nasty feeling that their reaction might be, like, hey, okay, you know, we had this relationship 30 years ago, you jilted us, we were upset, but kind of we've moved on now, and we're in bed with the Asians.
John Mills, come back on some of the points raised across, and then I'll come out.
I say I built up a company which trades with 85 different countries all over the world, and we sell to everybody who wants to buy from us. And honestly, the amount of time we spend worrying about whether you were in or out of the single market is zero. You just have to put up with the deals which you can get wherever you're trying to sell. And as far as the Commonwealth is concerned and all the rest of the world, China, South America, everywhere else, if we've got goods that they want to buy, they will buy them. And this is also true of the European Union. The fact that we're not in the single market will not stop people in France or Germany or anywhere else buying our goods if they're competitive and attractive, and that's what they want.
Is EU red tape getting in the way of your business operations, John Mills?
We've got plenty of red tape to deal with, that's for sure. Whether all the red tape we've got to deal with would disappear if we were outside the European Union, I think it's extremely unlikely.
I asked because we
might get rather less of it.
Sure. I mean, I asked just out of interest because clearly there are quite a lot of people on the left of British politics who will point to some of the regulations that have emerged from Brussels as being protective of the workers. You are a man of the left. I just wondered where you stand on that.
Well, what I can tell you is that there are 6 main categories of labour protection, of which 5 were already in place before we ever joined the European Union. I think the only one where the European Union took the initiative was on paternity leave. With all the rest of them, the British Parliament had already enacted very substantial amounts of protection already. This was enhanced in some respects as a result of coordination with Europe, but it was there basically.
I sense doubts.
Check it out.
I sense doubts.
That's a CBI social partner one, absolutely.
Well, just very specifically, the Working Time Directive, which is often held up as a piece of bad legislation. When it was first tabled, it wasn't great from a CBI perspective. We lobbied very hard against it and were able to get an opt-out from one of the key provisions, which was a limit on working hours. But it is important to recognise there are some provisions, the most costly provisions of that directive, around paid holiday, 4 weeks paid holiday, and paid rest breaks. And actually, no CBI members, no responsible businesses are coming and saying what we need to do in order to be more competitive is leave the European Union so we can end paid holiday and alleviate that cost on business. Actually, business recognises you need, paid rest breaks and paid holiday and so on. So even if we did leave, we'd have equivalent legislation in the UK on the most costly bit of the working time directive. We've got an opt-out on the bit that business really doesn't
Catherine, quick word, then I'll move it on to other matters.
Yeah, I've been asking this question. I've been in quite a lot of these debates of asking leavers what bits of red tape would you get rid of. I couldn't get an answer from Matthew Elliott of the Leave campaign. Jacob Rees-Mogg, quick as a flash, said all the financial services legislation, and I'd bring back the blue passports, which I thought was interesting. But I thought the most chilling answer came actually from one of the Brexit economists, who basically said we would get rid of all the legislation which costs business, and that is all the workplace legislation, gender diversity, and climate change and environment legislation. And I thought, great. So we're going back to the 1950s.
David Campbell Bannerman,
and that is not a world I want my children to grow up in.
Answer the question, Catherine.
Well, we've got we've got an awful lot to choose from. There's 700,000 pages of EU laws. It's a Nelson's column. I don't know how they worked it out, but it's a Nelson's column stack of paper. The Working Time Directive has been criticised by business, quite rightly. I go to hospitals in my constituency, and it costs them £3 to £4 million each, the Working Time Directive. Why do locums get paid thousands of pounds a shift? Because of this interference in the whole sort of administration of hospitals. It's killing the NHS in many ways. And that is just one directive, the Temporary Agency Workers Directive, which is destroying the flexible working economy. Belgium and France do not have a flexible economy. Believe me, I've lived there half the time, at the European Parliament. It's very, very hard to employ people. That's why the unemployment's so high.
But there is a point here, isn't there? There are concerns, Ed, about protecting the workforce and protecting the environment within some of these directives, and they might go as a result of us leaving.
What will happen, you'll have a UK Act where all the EU legislation gets put into it, because obviously directives come direct through the Westminster. The regulations and decisions from the European Court of Justice are kind of imposed on us from afar. You put it all in one UK Act, and then you spend 10 to 15 years reforming it. And every year you get rid of more laws that are bad for us, but you keep the good ones. You're not going to get rid of 4-week holidays.
Let me bring one more in the audience, if I may. There's a lady here, and a microphone coming to you. Yes.
Yes. What confidence would we have that the current UK government would enact legislation that would give us better protection of the environment or of workers' rights, human rights? I mean, that's my big fear, that we will get rid of European legislation, although we, in fact, produced much of it and it built up from the UK, but I just fear that with the current government, certainly, we would be taking very retrograde steps and we would end up with a lot less protection. Somebody mentioned working hours. Yes, great, we have flexible, let's have more 0-hour contracts, unlike the rest
Peter
of
Oborne
Europe.
would like to answer you. So,
I find myself nodding at the last point you were making, which I did feel that, there is a school of people who want to leave Europe, who want to turn us into something in the mid-Atlantic, sort of barbaric, sort of Donald Trump style dystopia. And I don't want that, and I don't think most sensible people do. But to answer your question very specifically, the answer is, of course, we don't know. We don't know what the next government would do. But I think the fact is, for me, it's terribly important that Britain makes up our mind. Your idea that we need to rely on Europe to impose laws so that because we're incapable of making our own is one I profoundly reject. No, that is the implication of what you were saying. I like to think the British people. You want to?
Yeah, come back briefly if you would.
I didn't say we were incapable, but that politically we would be unlikely to make as good as laws as we get from Europe.
Doesn't it depend how we vote?
Let's just deal with this. So, you're advocating a world where Donald Tusk and Juncker and all these great sages are capable of making decisions which the British people can't make. Now that is, I profoundly reject what you've just said.
Right. I don't think there's going to be a meeting of minds on that one. Are there any other points specifically in this area before I move it on to other things? Yes, sir.
I work in tech startups, and companies in the UK, tech startups, have to compete with American companies whose starting home country is 350 million people. You can launch a website in America, and with the same language, same currency, a single company entity, you can immediately trade with 350 million people. Their second market, Canada, 45 million people come in pretty same on the same rules. Any company starting in the UK has to currently navigate the EU, which is not bad but needs to get better, but then has to currently navigate further other smaller countries. We need to play with the EU so any startup country in the UK, a startup company, can play with the biggest possible immediate home market with a single corporate entity, a single trading structure and a single set of rules. We cannot compete in this new internet age, and I do respect the guys on the left. You know, you're all pre-internet and it's tremendous. There are some people. I'm sitting with my son and I'm planning for his future and the next generation. Companies in this new world are having to play in the 21st century, which is based on very different rules, and we need to play in the biggest home market possible.
Thank you very much for making that point. I'm going to move it on to immigration because I'm conscious of the time, and we have the worldwide web. Immigration. Is it not true to say, Lucy Thomas, that you cannot meaningfully control immigration in this country while we are a member of the European Union?
You absolutely can, as we currently do. We control our
border. The current
border.
government hasn't, though, has it?
The current government has a target, a cap of 100,000 a year. That's a decision for the government, and they were elected on that in their manifesto
and didn't meet
in 2015. But that's that's their aim.
Yeah.
Let's just be clear. We currently control our border. Our border is currently in Calais. We have border force in Calais to check people coming in. We've turned away 7,000 people from that border since 2010. So we absolutely do control our borders. And the really important point on free movement, which is what I think you're alluding to, is that in order to continue to trade freely with the single market, in the way we currently do, free movement is part of that. And if you're like Norway or Switzerland, where you continue to have access to the single market, like John was talking about, they too accept free movement.
But
so
how
it is
do you,
a condition of that free
I accept
access.
that, but how do you deal with the argument that says that public services are under strain because of the number of people coming into the country, that high levels of immigration have driven down wages for British workers because people from poorer countries have come in and been prepared to take lower wages within the laws of the land than they would otherwise have done? A lot of people have a great deal of concern about this specific issue, and they don't think being a member of the European Union can possibly help resolve it.
Sure, I think I absolutely understand those concerns, and I think people should only be allowed to come here if they are going to work hard, if they're going to pay into the system, if they are not going to come here and claim benefits. But let's just look at the numbers. In the NHS, for example, vital public service, there are 100,000 EU migrants currently working in our NHS in health and social services. EU migrants pay into the system a huge amount more than they take out in benefits. They contribute far more in taxes on average than British citizens do. So I think we've got to be clear about what EU migration actually does for our economy, and actually that you do benefit hugely from having EU migration. And the last point is that free movement works both ways. There are around 2 million EU migrants living here currently, as there are around 2 million Britons living in the rest of the EU, in Spain, in France and other places. So it's a two-way street from which we all benefit.
John Mills, we benefit from immigration at the levels that we are currently enjoying them, apparently.
Well, I think there are big problems about the level of immigration we've got at the moment, partly for the reasons you just described, the effect this has on the labour market and also the disincentive this is to investment. But I think the biggest single problem is what's happening on the strain on our whole accumulated capital, roads, schools, hospitals, everything. It's absolutely true that immigrants pay in about £3 billion a year more than they get out.
In which case that money should be spent on
wait
the
a minute.
schools and the hospitals.
Just to keep up with our rising population, we need to spend £70 billion a year on new investment just to avoid the schools and roads and everything else getting more crowded and more stressed. And we're nowhere near doing this. And everybody focuses on the current benefits from immigration. Everybody forgets the capital costs, which are absolutely massive. Now, apart from that, I mean, I do think there is a big problem with immigration generally. There's no easy solution to this problem. But to have large numbers of people coming across from Romania and Bulgaria, where the average wage, I believe, is something like 40% of our minimum wage, really is inviting trouble. If we go in for a £9 an hour minimum wage, while Europe continues to have these massive levels of unemployment, what do you think the situation is going to be like?
You're referring to the living wage that the Chancellor's bringing in.
Yes.
I'm going to go to David Campbell Bannerman on this. In terms of painting a picture as to once we leave, as you would like us to do, what sort of immigration policy should we then have in place?
Yes, I mean, just to be clear, it's not about being anti-foreigner or anti-immigrant. Immigration is good for the country and is necessary for the country, but you have to manage and control it. It's an issue about control. Now, I would say the best system is either Australia's point system or Canada's system, or even New Zealand. What they do is, I mean, Canada, for example, if they have a shortage of engineers, which is what we have in this country, they will go around the world and say, have you thought of coming to Canada? And they'll sort out visas and whatever it is. That's the kind of system we want. I mean, at the moment, we are turning away Indian doctors, American workers in the city, high-powered ones. A lot of skilled people are being turned away because we can't control the EU side. It's a lopsided, unfair, discriminatory immigration system that actually goes against the non-EU, including a lot of the Commonwealth. So we need to rebalance it.
Let me bring Andy in.
As those countries,
because I'm conscious of the time and I want to get the audience in on this as well. I'll come to you in a moment, sir. I saw your hand, rest assured. Andy Bagnall.
Well, look, I think the issues of immigration, of the current refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, and a free movement of people have all got a bit muddled up, and I think it is quite important to separate them out. Firstly, there would be pressure on Europe's borders from a refugee crisis, whether we're in or out of the European Union, and we obviously, I'm very proud as a country, have always accepted our obligations to take in those fleeing persecution and conflict. Immigration from out with the EU, as Lucy said, we have complete control over. It makes up over half of net migration into the UK. We could stop that overnight. We don't actually, for some of the reasons David's been talking about. For a start, it would shut down our university sector pretty much overnight. You might not know our tertiary education sector is the UK's 6th biggest export industry. You don't think of it as exports because the customer comes here to consume the export, but it brings in foreign currency. So free movement, and it's my last point, free movement is the thing we're talking about. From a business perspective and a UK PLC perspective, we absolutely recognise it's controversial, there's a cultural challenge, some pressure on services, but business has benefited. It allows it to plug skills gaps, run pan-European management chains.
It doesn't, though, if the argument that says you can do what Canada, as David Campbell Bannerman was saying, if you can be in a position to pick and choose, frankly, who you want and why and when. In other words, you've applauded that system when it applies beyond the EU, so why not embrace it within the EU system by getting out,
well,
he would argue.
As I've said, free movement is part of the package. So
right,
Lucy said,
absolutely, yeah, but they don't want it to be part of the package.
No, indeed, I accept that, but I think there's a trade-off between the economic benefit that we derive, that businesses, and CBI, as I said, represents 190,000 businesses. Businesses get a benefit from that, which ultimately makes UK PLC better
Catherine,
off.
quick word, then Peter, then the audience.
Yeah, I know this is a very controversial idea in the UK, but one of the issues about immigration in the UK is once you're here, and nobody can control how long people are here. They can't trace where they are, and so people who arrive illegally or legally for short times disappear.
And that frustrates people because they don't believe the numbers.
Absolutely. And if we had ID cards, heaven forbid, you can actually trace where people are, how long they've been here, whether they're paying their taxes, whether they are legitimately here or not. And it works very well on the continent. And I think it is a mechanism that we need to think about, because otherwise, you can't actually find the people who shouldn't be here and control the export as well as the import of people.
We went there some years ago, I seem to remember, politically, and it didn't happen. Peter Oborne.
I think it's a very important and difficult and delicate issue. And Lucy Thomas is completely wrong. You can't control our borders. inside the EU because we have this commitment to bring a free movement of people.
But we're not in Schengen, Peter, are we?
Nevertheless, if you look at we have this commitment to free movement of people.
We do.
Now, it's very nice for us in Chiswick. It means us prosperous people here, we get much cheaper domestic labour, and we like that. Our cleaners come cheaper, and in the CBI, it's absolutely glorious because you get the Bulgarians and Romanians coming in, where, as Mr. Mills just said, the average wage is 40%, less than half of our minimum wage. It's unbelievable. For the big fat cat bosses, it drives up company profits like nobody's business. And so there's this interesting sort of a congregation of opinion between the fat cat bosses represented by that chap and sort of the Polly Toynbees of this world, who can be very, very virtuous about immigration because she gets a cheaper cleaner. But now the important point.
Polly Toynbee's not here to respond.
No, but or any other. But the key.
Yes, okay. Yeah,
what is the key point, which is very, very important? I'm surprised John Mills, who's on the left, didn't make it more strongly. It cuts working local people, British people, out of a job. And David Rose, the head of the Vote In campaign, he said it will drive down wages if we stay in the EU. And it was not the Daily Mirror, which is a left-wing paper, which is supposed to appeal to working class people, suppressed that information. And it's an interesting, very important point.
Andy Bagnall, I just wanted to come to you specifically on the point that Peter raised, because there is a clear divide, isn't there, between the big companies who broadly want to stay in and the smaller and medium-sized businesses who are far more sceptical. And maybe the reason has just been alighted upon by Peter Oborne.
That's it. It's exactly the point I wanted to address to you. Look, the CBI is a confederation. We represent 190,000 businesses, small, medium and large. So not entirely just
But the body that represents smaller businesses is much keener to get out.
There is a tighter margin. If you look at the Federation of Small Businesses survey, it's still a majority of their businesses, and they represent all of the micro businesses down to hairdressers and so on, still a majority wish to remain, but it is tighter. Small members in CBI membership are actually pretty much in line with our membership generally. Okay. The reason we have for explaining that is it's not about small or large. It's about whether you export or don't export. And there's a much higher propensity of larger businesses to export, so they see the benefits of a single market more directly. Some smaller businesses, perhaps even ones in a supply chain to export, but they don't feel directly the benefits of being part of that market.
Andy, let me I'm sorry to interrupt. Apologies for that. I just want to bring the audience in because I'm conscious of the time with a thought on immigration. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I think Andy's already made most of the points I wanted to make. I do actually have a business interest in the northeast of England and spend a lot of my time out of W4, Peter, so do see how the other half live. And there's a very popular programme that was based around a number of Geordies called Auf Wiedersehen Pet. And what happened there were a group of British unemployed construction workers at a time of recession here went over to Germany to earn money, and eventually when things got better, they came back. We seem to be saying, actually, those very countries in East Europe who we as a country, and the Conservative Party in particular, have encouraged to join as part of eastward expansion of the European Union, their people are probably going to come here and do the same. We have low unemployment and so forth. It seems to me it's a little bit like it suited us then and it doesn't suit us, so we're on our way out. Not very good, I don't think.
Thank you for making that point, sir. Any others on that specific issue of immigration, free movement, etc.? I'm waiting to see a hand. Was that a hand or a fan being waved because it's a bit warm in here? Right, it's not a hand. Anybody else who want to make a point about immigration? Yes, sir. Behind you, Bridget, to your immediate right.
I am in a very strange position here because I have citizenship of an EU country as well as citizenship of Canada. So this is why I'm sort of interested in all this. So I myself and my education have benefited heavily from the freedom movement. I was educated in Germany, I grew up in Canada, and I moved here to work. And I would feel like if you deny the next generation that ability to study and work and move through the EU and go effortlessly through an amazing system where you can go to school cheaply in Germany for a tenth of what it is here, 340 euros in Baden-Württemberg in southern Germany a year. And all these other things, you're denying them all these things. How do you come to that? Do you think that's fair to deny them that?
Can I leave that one sort of hanging to an extent, because I think we kind of know what the answer is going to be on either side to an extent, based on what we've heard over the last hour and a half. The reason I'm doing that is because I'm conscious of the clock, and I just wanted to ask, was there one more, Bridget? I'm so sorry. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
It's just the question about if we leave and Scotland stays, how will that work out?
You mean Scotland votes to stay?
Yeah, Scotland gets its referendum to leave.
Peter
Scotland
Oborne,
leaves.
have a thought on that, if you would.
The Scottish point.
Yes.
And I have to say that it is, as somebody who wants to leave and somebody who believes in the union, it does worry me, actually. I think it's, I don't think we can allow that to determine how we vote, but it does, I do think that it's an important point.
Thank you for raising it. I just want to ask either side if they'd like to be honest for a couple of minutes, and then I will take that vote. And I'm not implying that they haven't been for the last hour and a half, I'd like to stress. The idea being that I'm just keen to hear from the Remain side what they find is the toughest argument from the Leave side to counter, and then I'll ask the Leave side the same question. I don't know who would like to volunteer that. A moment of honesty and pragmatism. Yes, Catherine.
Yeah, no, I think there's the point about the companies that don't export, the people who don't travel, they don't see what the advantage of the EU is. And, as I said, I spent all my professional life working around the EU institutions. I've looked at it right up close. It's not all as bad as people like to make out, but there's plenty that doesn't work very well and needs improving. But I think, it is very difficult for people who don't really want to move beyond their local town, and they don't see any reason for it. And we've been very, UK citizens have been very poorly served by our press and our politicians for the last 30 or 40 years in really explaining what are the benefits and the downsides being in the EU. And so, this referendum campaign is a great opportunity. I never talked so much about the EU as I have in the last 30 years. But, we've got 6 weeks to make up 30 years, and that's tough.
Thank you for your candour on that. On this side, would somebody like to volunteer what they think is the strongest argument that they have to counter from the Remain side? John, I sense you are...
Yes, I think the strongest argument is the fear campaign that you're implementing at the moment, which, I think there's no doubt at all about the fact it has been done. And it's incredible to see this lineup we've got of the OECD and the Treasury and everybody else.
Experts, yes.
Well, maybe they are, but it's
employed by Osborne.
I'll tell you something. It's the same lot of people who told us that we ought to be joining the Euro 10 or 12 years ago. Mostly it is. It's the same lot of people who said that when we were in the exchange rate mechanism in the 1990s, that if we left, and this includes John Major, that if we left, we'd have inflation, the economy would go downhill. What actually happened is the economy grew for the next 15 years. It's the same lot of people who didn't foresee any of the problems that came up in 2008. So why should we believe them now?
I'm not sure whether that was a... I'm not sure that was a direct answer to my question, but I'll take the point you made. Right, I'm now going to open, exactly as I suggested at the start of the proceedings, to see if anybody here is prepared to say that they were undecided when they walked in and that you have changed your mind in either direction, or at least you're closer to a conclusion than you were at the start of the last hour and a half. Anybody sort of wavering, anybody's mind being changed? Ah, madam, yes. What's happened in your mind in the last hour and a half?
I think for me, I'm an education consultant, and I'm half Welsh, half Geordie, so the whole Leave stay is, in a sense, is quite an emotional thing for me, but I'm not emotionally driven. So for me, this debate, it's all about facts, and I believe that I've had more facts from the stay debate than I have.
Oh well, that's raised clearly doubts in other people's minds. Anybody else who's been influenced by specifically anything they've heard tonight that might have changed their mind? Yes, sir, right in the front row.
We haven't really touched on security, but I'd like to know what the panel thinks, which side the European Army will be on.
Well, can I ask very briefly, because I'm conscious of the time, David Campbell Bannerman, you raised the prospect of an EU army, so perhaps you ought to deal with that very briefly if you would.
It's real. It's in President Juncker's programme. The leak just a week ago from Merkel showed that she wants a single army. It's very, very dangerous. I mean, who are they going to die for, and who are they going to fight?
And Britain could veto it, presumably.
Well, at the moment we have a veto.
Ah.
That is true, and we have, yeah, but hang on, there's going to be a treaty change, and every time we have a treaty change, what happens? Vetoes disappear. The Lisbon Treaty got rid of 60 vetoes. The next treaty will get rid of some very serious vetoes. So don't rely on the other side. And by the way, just on facts, only 4 trade agreements out of 140 have freedom of movement. And I've heard this, and all these debates have been, oh, well, you've got to sign up to the package. It's not true.
I want to get one Remain voice on the question that the gentleman raised in the interest of balance. Andy looks keenest.
Well, just to say, look, firstly, you've already accepted that there is a veto over national defence. That's something we retain sovereignty over. But also, I touched on this earlier. All of the security threats that we face, we will have to approach in concert with allies. It's actually always been the way. The British Army is almost always deployed alongside allies. I've been to Afghanistan, and I've watched there, actually, allies working together against a common threat. I've seen a Danish battalion embedded, working in a British brigade with a British Major General. So actually, that kind of defence, closer cooperation, it's not about a European army, it's about working together with allies, even in those extreme circumstances when we need military cooperation. Interoperability is a good thing. It doesn't mean having a European army.
Right. There are 2 things I think we can all agree upon. It is 9 o'clock, according to that clock. And perhaps the most important thing that I suspect you'd all like to say, or I'll say it on your behalf, is that whatever people think, you'd like them to vote on the 23rd of June, which is the date. And register indeed, which there's a campaign indeed, yes. Register first and then vote is probably the most sensible order. David, John, Peter, Catherine, Andy and Lucy, thank you all very much indeed for being a part of this. Thank you very much for coming as well. Thank you.